New York City, 1998. Grand Central Terminal pulses with movement, briefcases clicking against marble floors, voices echoing beneath vaulted ceilings, destinations announced in rhythmic urgency. But beneath this grand choreography of transit, a man sits alone, quiet and invisible. He wears a weathered army jacket, a wool blanket folded across his lap, and carries everything he owns in a backpack stained by years of travel. His name is Henry Lawson, though no one knows it. To passers-by, he's just another homeless man in a city too busy to look twice. But Henry wasn't always here. Decades ago, he served in Vietnam, later in Desert Storm. He once carried orders, not bags. He led men, he held the line, and when the wars ended, the silence began. Miles away in a quiet New Jersey suburb lives 10-year-old Ellie Dawson. She loves puzzles, old books, and weekends with her grandmother, Margaret. One Saturday morning, they visit a flea market in Hoboken. Ellie sifts through a box of vintage postcards, mostly views of the Grand Canyon, Niagara Falls, and old Brooklyn. One card catches her eye. The handwriting is shaky but heartfelt. It's postmarked Saigon, 1973. The message reads, "Dear Maggie, not a day goes by I don't think of you. I'll be home soon, I promise. Love always. Henry L." Ellie hands it to her grandmother. Margaret freezes, her lips part, but no sound comes. Slowly, she sits down on a wooden crate nearby. Tears begin to fill her eyes. "That's him," she says. "That's Henry, my fiancé." Ellie stares. "But you said he died in the war." "That's what they told me," Margaret replies softly. "They said he went missing in action, that he never came back." But the postcard is dated months after his reported disappearance. Something doesn't fit. Something was hidden, or lost, or maybe just forgotten. Ellie becomes quietly obsessed. She asks questions, searches libraries, digs through old phone books and online databases. With the help of her school librarian and a family friend who works for the NYPD, she begins piecing together a strange thread. Rumors of a veteran, a drifter who moves between train stations, a man who speaks in fragments, who sometimes answers to the name Captain. The trail leads her back to Grand Central, to Platform 17, to a man whose face looks hauntingly familiar to a faded photograph in her grandmother's attic. And suddenly, this isn't just history, it's family. If this story touched you the way it moved me while writing it, give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that inspire, surprise, and move. And now, get ready, because what happens next will change everything. Ellie couldn't stop thinking about the postcard. It sat quietly on her nightstand, encased in a plastic sleeve, as though it was some fragile, sacred artifact from another life, and every time she looked at it, she felt as if a story long buried was beginning to stir, whispering to her through the faded ink and worn corners that something about her family's past was not what she'd always believed. At breakfast the next morning, she brought it down with her, laying it gently beside her bowl of cereal as her parents busied themselves with coffee and morning routines, not realizing that a mystery was unfolding right in front of them. Her mother barely glanced at it, dismissing it as just another one of Ellie's quirky vintage finds. But Margaret, Ellie's grandmother, froze the moment her eyes landed on the handwriting. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling as she touched the postcard, and then, without a word, sat down as though someone had pulled the ground from beneath her feet. "I never thought I'd see this again," she murmured, her voice tight with something Ellie had never heard before, a mixture of memory and disbelief that made the room fall silent. Ellie leaned in, her curiosity blooming. "But I thought, you said he died." Margaret nodded faintly, still staring at the card. "That's what they told me. They said he went missing in action in Vietnam. No body, no answers, just gone. I waited for months, then years. Eventually I stopped hoping. I kept the letters, though. I never had the heart to throw them away." That afternoon, Ellie climbed into the attic alone, flashlight in hand. navigating through the dust and silence of stored-away decades until she found a small, dented metal box hidden behind a pile of old holiday decorations. Inside were letters, each one addressed to Margaret Dawson, written in a hand she now recognized from the postcard. Some were cheerful and romantic, written from training camps in Georgia and Fort Bragg, while others, penned from the jungles of Southeast Asia, carried the heavy tone of a man doing his best to hold on to love in a place designed to break it. She read every word. One letter in particular stood out, dated March 1973, 3 months after Henry was declared missing. And in it, he wrote not of fear or pain, but of his desire to come home, to find her waiting, to start a life that had been put on hold far too long. That letter made something inside her click. If he was writing months after the army said he was gone, then maybe he hadn't died at all. Maybe he'd returned, but not to the life he left. Ellie brought the letters to school the next day and showed them to Mr. Carmichael, the librarian, who had once told her that stories are like doors. You just have to find the key. He read the letters in silence, nodding thoughtfully, and then said, "You've got something here, Ellie. This isn't just history, it's a missing person story that never got solved." Together they scoured online archives and veteran databases, combing through obituaries and records, until they found an old article from the New York Post, dated 1995. The headline read, "Nam vet haunts Grand Central, no ID, only memories." The man described in the article lived among the benches and platforms, speaking in cryptic sentences about the war, sometimes answering to "Captain," often retreating into silence. He had no name, no family, just an old duffel bag and a habit of saluting strangers in passing. When Ellie printed the article and brought it to Margaret, her grandmother stared at the grainy photograph for what felt like a lifetime. Finally, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "That's him. That's Henry." The next Saturday, with her father by her side, Ellie traveled to Grand Central Terminal. They walked the corridors slowly, scanning each bench, each quiet corner as announcements echoed and crowds flowed past them like rivers around stones. On their third visit, near Platform 17, they found him, an older man in a torn army jacket, his head bowed, hands resting on his knees. His eyes were closed, and his face was thinner than the photograph, but Ellie recognized the outline, the sadness, the history. She approached him with caution, holding her breath, and when she finally spoke, "Excuse me, are you Henry Lawson?" The man opened one eye, blinking in confusion, and asked in a gravelly voice, "Who's asking?" Ellie didn't hesitate. She pulled the postcard from her coat pocket and held it out. "I think this belongs to you. I'm Ellie, Margaret's granddaughter." He took the card slowly, his hands shaking as he turned it over, and then something in his expression cracked. He touched the ink like it was skin, as if the words could bleed memory, and then he whispered, "I wrote this to Maggie." "She got it," Ellie said softly. "She kept it. She never stopped thinking about you." He looked up at her, really looked, and in that moment, surrounded by the endless rush of strangers and the hum of trains, Henry Lawson remembered who he was. After that first meeting at the train station, something changed, not just for Ellie, who now carried a new sense of purpose like a secret flame in her chest, but for Henry, who, for the first time in years, had looked someone in the eyes and felt not suspicion or pity, but recognition. He returned to the same bench every afternoon now, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because Ellie came back, and with her came something he had thought forever lost, the feeling of being seen. She brought him a notebook and a thermos of tea, and sometimes, if the weather allowed, they sat together on the old wooden bench beneath the stained glass windows of Grand Central's West Hall, where the sun filtered in like memory through dust. Henry spoke slowly, often stopping mid-sentence, as if the words had to travel a long way through time before they could reach his tongue. But Ellie waited, never interrupting, always listening. "It didn't happen all at once," he said one day, his voice rough from years of silence. "Coming home, I mean." You think you'll get off the plane and everything will be the same, that the streets will look like they used to, that the people will still know your name, but they don't, and after a while you don't either. He told her how, after returning from Vietnam, he had been kept at a military hospital for months, recovering from injuries both visible and hidden. How he was discharged with no ceremony, no instructions, no one waiting for him. How he drifted through cities and jobs and temporary beds, trying to stitch together a life with broken hands and a fractured sense of self. There were moments, he said, when I wanted to go to her, to Maggie. I had her address memorized, but I was afraid I'd knock on the door and see her with someone else. Or worse, that she'd look at me and not recognize who I'd become. Ellie listened, her pencil gliding across her notebook. She wasn't just collecting facts. She was collecting pieces of him, words he had forgotten, names he barely whispered, places that had no coordinates except in his mind. He spoke of Saigon, of long nights under flickering fluorescent lights, writing letters by hand in the heat, pressing them into the metal mailbox as if they were prayers. He remembered faces, some with names, others just shadows in the fog, and one day he reached into his duffel bag and handed Ellie a torn envelope, yellowed with time. I never mailed this one, he said. It was the last one I wrote, after the attack. Ellie unfolded it carefully. Inside, a single page, written in the same looping script as the postcard. If I make it out of this, I'm coming home. I swear it. The page trembled in her hands. Why didn't you? Henry stared ahead, watching the rush of people move through the terminal like a river that never stopped. I made it out, but I didn't come home, because home wasn't there anymore, or I wasn't. I'm not sure which. It became their ritual, these meetings among the marble and steel and footsteps of strangers. Ellie began recording his stories, not just in writing, but on a small tape recorder her father gave her. They spoke about childhood, about growing up in Tennessee, about the first time he held a rifle and the last time he let go of hope. Each tale was like a puzzle piece returned to its place, a part of Henry being reassembled in real time. She brought photos next, of Maggie, younger and older. Henry held each one like it was glass, as if the woman in them might speak if he touched her gently enough. She never married again, Ellie said. She had relationships, but none that lasted. She kept your letters in a tin box. She read them on your birthday every year. Henry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I thought I'd vanished, he said, like smoke. I didn't know I was missed. More weeks passed, and Henry began to speak not just of the past, but of the present. The people who had helped him survive, the small kindnesses that had kept him from disappearing entirely. Ellie, in turn, told him about her school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a writer or maybe a historian. I want to tell stories, she said. True ones, yours. He smiled, a rare thing. Then you already are. One afternoon, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small, worn locket on a broken chain. I was going to give this to her the day I got back, he said. It's been with me ever since. I don't know why I kept it, maybe to remember who I was. He pressed it into Ellie's palm. I think she'd want you to have it. She clutched it, stunned. I'll keep it safe, I promise. And as they sat there, a forgotten soldier and a girl with a notebook, the terminal moved around them, but they were still. Memory, once fragmented, was beginning to hold. The day Margaret agreed to meet Henry, the sky was the color of old photographs, pale gray, tinged with a kind of weight that made the air feel heavy, as if the world itself understood that something long buried was about to surface. Ellie had shown her the recordings, the letters, and most of all, the truth. Henry Lawson had never died, never disappeared into the void entirely, but had lived in plain sight, just beneath the notice of the world that once called him a hero. He had not been lost, only unseen. Margaret hadn't said much at first. She held the old locket in her hands, tracing her fingers across the initials inside. Her eyes glistened, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost afraid of being wrong. He's really alive? Ellie nodded. And he remembers everything. He thought you moved on. He thought he didn't belong anymore. Margaret took a breath. He was wrong. They met outside Grand Central on a wooden bench just beyond the main entrance, where the sounds of the city softened into distant horns and shuffled footsteps. Henry was already there, seated upright, cleaner now, wearing a fresh shirt and a trimmed beard, thanks to a caseworker Ellie had convinced to help him get temporary benefits and a safe place to stay. But despite his neater appearance, he looked nervous, almost fragile, like a man waiting for a verdict rather than a reunion. When Margaret approached, Henry stood slowly. His hands twitched at his sides, unsure of whether to reach for her or not. She stopped a few feet away, studying him. The deepened lines, the way his eyes still carried the same warmth, the same sorrow. "Hello, Henry," she said, her voice catching. Henry looked at her as if she were a vision that might disappear at any moment. "Maggie," he breathed, "you're still you." They didn't embrace, not yet, but something shifted in the air between them. A long-held breath finally exhaled. "I thought you were gone," Margaret said. "We were told you'd never made it out, that you were MIA. Henry nodded slowly. "I was, for a long time, even to myself." They sat down side by side, the silence between them thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Ellie stood nearby, quiet, watching history mend itself one glance at a time. Henry spoke first, his voice low. "I wrote to you, after the blast, after I was moved to a hospital out of country, but they never sent the letters. I didn't have an address. I didn't know what home meant anymore. By the time I made it back stateside, everything felt distant. I didn't want to walk back into your life like a ghost." "You should have," Margaret said. "I waited for you. I married, yes, eventually, but it was never the same. I loved someone else, but I never forgot you. I never let go." Henry looked down at his hands. "I became someone else. Not the man you loved, not a soldier, just a shadow in a station." Margaret reached for his hand, slow, deliberate, and firm. "You're here now. That's all that matters." The moment was simple, quiet, but it rippled through Ellie like a bell in a cathedral. She stepped forward, offering them both a photo she had printed, an image of the two of them from 1969, dancing in the back of a pickup truck under strings of lights. Margaret smiled at the photo. Henry touched it as if it were made of memory. "We were kids," Margaret said, "but I think we knew then. Some loves just wait." After that day, Henry and Margaret began to see each other regularly, walking through parks, sharing coffee in quiet corners of the city, talking late into the afternoon about the years they had both lived apart, the people they had become, and the pieces of their past that still felt sharp. There was no talk of romance, no attempt to rewrite what life had written over. But there was healing, deep and unspoken, in being able to say, "You mattered and you still do." Meanwhile, Ellie's school project evolved into something far bigger. What had started as a class report had now become a local news story, then a citywide feature. "Veteran found after decades, thanks to postcard and granddaughter's curiosity," the headlines read. The piece ran with side-by-side photos of Henry, one in uniform, one taken by Ellie on the bench at Grand Central. People began reaching out, former soldiers, long-lost friends, families of MIA servicemen who had always wondered if their loved ones might still be out there. One man even recognized Henry from a medical unit they'd shared in 1974 in Japan. "You helped me walk again," he wrote in a letter, "and I never got to thank you." Henry was overwhelmed. He had spent so long thinking he was invisible, expendable, a man the world had chosen to forget. Now people were remembering, not only him, but the hundreds like him who had slipped through the cracks, not because they weren't brave or valuable, but because the noise of peace had drowned their silent return. One evening, sitting beside Ellie on the same bench where they'd first met, Henry looked up at the ceiling of Grand Central, at the painted constellations above them. "You know," he said, "for a long time I thought no one was looking up, that no one saw people like me anymore." Ellie smiled gently, "But I did." And in that moment, for the first time in a very long time, Henry Lawson believed her. With Henry now safely housed in a modest veterans' shelter on the Upper West Side, a small but clean room with a window that overlooked the trees of Riverside Park. Something began to shift, not only in his circumstances, but in his spirit. The silence that had once enveloped him like a fog began to lift, slowly, day by day, as if memory itself had given him permission to breathe again. The room was spare, a single bed with a neatly folded blanket, a shelf with books Ellie had brought him, and a bulletin board where he pinned photographs, snapshots of his younger self, a black and white picture of Margaret, a hand-drawn portrait Ellie had made with the words, "So no one forgets your face." There was dignity in the quiet simplicity, and Henry, though still tentative in his steps, was beginning to stand a little taller. Ellie visited him after school every Tuesday and Thursday, carrying new notebooks, sometimes cookies, and often more questions. She had started writing everything down, not just his war stories, but his observations, his silences, the way he looked at people as though still surprised they saw him. "Do you think you've changed?" she asked one afternoon as they sat by his window, watching the wind play with the branches. Henry thought for a moment, then smiled. "I think I came back to myself, but I had help." He had begun writing again, short essays, fragments of letters, small poems. Words he never thought he'd use again found their way onto paper, not as decoration, but as testimony. "I used to think no one wanted to hear these stories," he told Ellie once, "but maybe I just needed the right person to ask." The school had caught wind of Ellie's ongoing project, and soon her history teacher arranged a day for Henry to speak to the class. He arrived in his cleanest shirt, his voice rough but steady, his hands holding the same notebook he and Ellie had been filling for weeks. He didn't speak like a veteran giving a speech. He spoke like a man sharing what it meant to be forgotten and what it felt like to be found. He talked about sleeping in stations, about how people averted their eyes, about how the absence of a name was worse than hunger. But he also talked about the postcard, how a single card written decades ago had found its way back into his hands because a little girl had chosen to care. After his talk, the room was still. Then came the questions. "Did you ever feel like giving up?" one boy asked. Henry nodded. "Every day, but the trick isn't to pretend you're okay. The trick is to let someone in." That afternoon changed something at the school. Students who had never spoken about their grandparents' wars started asking questions. A mural was painted in the main hallway with silhouettes of unknown soldiers and the words, "Their stories live here," and in the center, Henry's name. Ellie compiled everything into a small book, a limited run printing the school library funded, titled The Man at Platform 17. It included excerpts from Henry's writings, photos, quotes from classmates, and a foreword by Ellie herself. "This isn't a story about war," she wrote. "It's a story about being seen." The book drew attention from local news, and soon Henry was invited to speak at a veteran storytelling night at the New York Public Library. The room was filled with people who had walked through battles of their own, some in uniforms, others in grief. Henry stood at the podium, his hands shaking slightly, and read a passage Ellie had chosen. "I don't need statues or flags," he said. "I just needed someone to say my name," and she did. Afterward, strangers approached him with tears, with gratitude, with stories of their own fathers, brothers, friends. It was as if his voice had unlocked something not only in himself, but in the hearts of others who had carried silence too long. Back in his room, the bulletin board filled up. Letters arrived, from students, from veterans, from readers. One envelope came with no return address, only a note. "Thank you for reminding us we're still here." One sunny afternoon in the spring of 2001, Ellie brought Henry a plaque engraved with his full name. It was meant for his door. She had saved up her allowance to have it made. Henry took it in his hands, ran a finger across the lettering, Henry A. Lawson, U.S. Army veteran, and smiled in a way that made Ellie's eyes burn. "You gave me back my name," he said quietly, "and I won't let it go again." Henry Lawson passed away quietly in the early hours of a rainy April morning in 2001. A nurse doing rounds at the veterans' shelter found him in bed, lying peacefully beneath his folded blanket, with a worn photograph of Margaret on the nightstand and the engraved plaque Ellie had given him proudly displayed on his door. The radio in his room was still playing softly, an old jazz tune fading into silence. News of his death spread quickly through the small circle that had grown around him in his final years. The students who had heard him speak, the staff who had helped him reclaim his benefits, and the neighbors who had come to know him not as a drifter or a ghost, but as a man with a history and a voice, gathered in a modest chapel on the Upper West Side to say goodbye. There was no flag-draped casket, no ceremonial salute, just a photo, a few folded letters, and the postcard that had started it all, framed behind glass with the caption, "He came home." Margaret sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the locket resting against her chest. She didn't speak much, but her presence, quiet, dignified, was its own kind of tribute. When it was Ellie's turn to say something, she stepped to the front, holding the notebook she had once used to collect Henry's words. "He told me once that what scared him most wasn't dying," she said. "It was being erased, forgotten, disappeared between the lines of other people's lives." She paused, then smiled, but he wasn't forgotten, and he never will be. In the months that followed, Ellie worked with her school and several veterans groups to establish a small non-profit, Name Them All, dedicated to collecting the stories of veterans who had fallen through the cracks of history. With the help of volunteers and donations, the project expanded into interviews, documentaries, and school partnerships. Students across the state were encouraged to adopt a veteran's name and learn their story, not as a lesson in war, but as a lesson in humanity. Ellie continued to write, inspired by what Henry had given her, not just a story, but a purpose. She studied history in college, later becoming an oral historian and advocate for unsheltered veterans. In every room she worked in, she carried Henry's story with her, not as a burden, but as a torch. At home, above her writing desk, hung the framed postcard. It remained there for decades, yellowed slightly with age, but still legible. Underneath, in bold letters, a line Henry once wrote in her notebook: "A man isn't gone when he dies. He's gone when no one says his name." Ellie made sure his name and others like his would always be spoken. We share real stories like this every day. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Help us bring more forgotten voices back into the light.